Did God really create everything? Today, we kick off a new series through the book of Genesis, and we're going to answer this question and so much more of what does the beginning of the Bible really say, and how does it affect our outlook on our world? Let's check it out.
Well, good morning. How are we doing today? I always get a clap sometimes when I get that good morning. It didn't catch on that time, but it's all right. We'll get there. Hey, today we are excited that you are here. And right after service, as Scott said, if you are new here, you've been checking us out, and you are not involved with the Cross Church family, I want to invite you to stick around as we have our pizza with the pastor. And this is where we just talk about what is our church about and how you can be involved. Well, I woke up this morning and I was feeling great, and I'm always the first one in the church, and I usually practice my sermon by myself, which always goes great. You know, get lots of laughs, it's lots of applause. And then I'm walking around more through the church, and somehow I hurt myself, I have a pinched nerve in my neck or something, so I can't turn fully. So if my normal range of motion is not there, just I'm getting a little bit older, I guess. Someone said, watch out, you'll just randomly sprain your ankle. And then I was like, well, this week I stepped out of my minivan with flip-flops and sprained my ankle almost. So I'm like, okay, I'm getting there. It's a scary time out there. That's all I got to say. But this morning we are kicking off our new series, studying through the book of Genesis. And I'm excited about this because this has been on the heart of our staff for a while as we've been talking about what do we preach next? And this is one we highlighted a year plus ago, and we started mapping out this book. And this is going to be ambitious because we're going to take a long time to go through this book, and we're going to kind of piece this through. But it's hard to kind of start it. And the beginnings, and we're going to talk about the beginning of the Bible today, beginnings are tricky. Beginnings of relationships, beginnings of jobs. And I think maybe the trickiest beginnings are starting a new show to binge watch through. Okay, anybody with me? You're like, I don't even care. I love TV shows, and I love them even more now that I have 3 children that all go to bed at 7 o'clock, because if they go to bed at 7 and my wife goes shopping, what do? I watch TV shows, right? And put an AirPod in and I'm good to go. And as I'm watching shows, I just finished one up recently, I've started to develop a philosophy of how binge watching shows go. And here's some of my great knowledge to share with you that you're so excited to hear about. And you're like, why did I come today? That dramas usually start off the best because they put their best content, their creative content. Usually the beginning of a drama or a serious show is pretty exciting. And usually it's really good for a couple seasons, and then it takes a turn because they ran out of all their good ideas to get it greenlit. And then they're like, we're just getting money, so we're going to write something. But then comedies are the different. Comedies start off terrible, and I'm just like, hey, watch it for a season. And someone's like, I don't want to watch it for a season when it's not funny. I'm like, but you'll learn to love these people, and then you'll find their interactions funny. And as we come to the Bible and we come to the book of Genesis, we're going to see that this isn't the case for kind of either of these. Instead, the book of Genesis begins the Bible in an amazing way. Literally, when we come to the book of Genesis, this is a literary masterpiece of a beginning of any other religion that we've never seen before. And what's amazing about the Bible is it starts in Genesis, but it doesn't slump later on. And it doesn't kind of lose its audiences or lose its luster, but it just continues its torrid pace through this gigantic book until it ultimately eventually arrives in the hope of the world in the New Testament, Jesus Christ. But you see, all that is hinted at. All that has its foundation laid, and it sets the stage in this book we approach today, Genesis. If you have your Bible, or you can scan the code in front of you to get all the notes on the Bible app, but we're going to be in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And then you can grab the book in front of you, the Bible in front of you in the seat. This is going to be the easiest one to find you ever have. You don't even have to go to the table of contents, right? Page 1, just past the table of contents. It's not like XXVI or something, when you don't know what those words actually mean. Get me to page 1. Page 1 is where we're going to be diving into today. And here's what we're going to start. And we're going to really pretty much preach 2 verses and a little bit more today. But it all starts here. And we're going to kind of get the overall idea of the path we're headed down Genesis. But it all starts in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And the first thing we're going to see when we start this book is the assumption of Genesis. Verse 1, start reading here. It says this, that in the beginning, God. You guys sure you're ready for this? Because that's where I'm going to stop right now. Now, are you sure you're ready for what we just read? All it said is, in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. Now, I want to break this down for a second, because the first question that my brain asks is, well, when is this happening? Well, it tells us, in the beginning. But the beginning of what, right? It just says in the beginning, like the beginning of a story, the beginning of our story, the beginning of like what's happening here. Well, as you read a little bit further, you get some context clues that it's the beginning of almost everything we know. Now, what do I mean by when I say almost? Well, because there was something there already. Anyone want to know what that was? God. It says in the beginning, God. God was just there. It doesn't say, let me tell you how God came to be. Let me tell you how God just burst and there all of a sudden God was. It just says in the beginning, and God was already a leading character that was already there. And if you read the Bible, you don't get any more depth into this of like, where did God come from? How did God come about? Where was God? Like, there's nothing behind God. Like, and this is the first assumption. This is going to blow your mind right now. God has no origin story. Okay? And there's some depth here. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But like, think of it this way. I love superhero movies, all right? Every Marvel movie, I've seen them all. I used to make my wife watch them all, actually, when we were dating. And I barely get her to watch any now that we're married because she fooled me and thought she actually cared. And then when we got married, she's like, I'm not watching any of that garbage. I got her to watch Spider-Man, but after that, yeah, it's probably not good. But one of the reasons I love superhero movies is they give origin stories. You get background of the character, and you almost think you can relate to that character. Like if I just get bit by a radioactive spider, I could become Spider-Man, right? If I just had a government experiment on me in World War II and then got frozen for 70 years, I could be Captain America. Okay. But the point of these origin stories is to give something far-fetched, give to something crazy, but also have these human emotions that you can relate to. But in the beginning of the book of Genesis, God's goal is not that we can relate to him as the creator of the universe. God has no relation. When we hear in the beginning God, it's not like, oh, I can relate to that. He's like, no, you can't. I'm about to do some creating. And I am so much bigger than your brain can even comprehend. And here's the thing, if God was created, which he was not, then he would cease to be God. In the beginning, God is a concept that goes so far beyond our brain. He was eternal, and he is eternal, and will always be eternal, and we can't even begin to think about it. Don't think too hard right now, because your head will just spiral into an abyss, and you won't hear anything else I'm saying. Trust me, I did it happen about 10 times as I was preparing the sermon. But you're like, if God was created, then like it wouldn't make sense. One famous preacher said this, that if you can get past Genesis 1:1, then you can get past the rest of the Bible. If you can have faith that God was just there, and we can't explain it, we don't know how, then you can kind of understand everything else. Sometimes people get hung up on, they're like, well, how could you put two animals on a boat? Like, how can you put two of each species? Like, that'd be a really big boat. It's like, but you just believe God just existed and nothing else, and we have no explanation. If you can believe that, you can believe a boat and an ark. If you can believe that God was there, then you can believe a man got swallowed by a giant fish, right? We're going to talk about both those stories in Genesis. If you believe that a guy could raise from the dead, you can believe that if you can believe here. I believe this is the ultimate faith step, that everything else is kind of downhill from here. But here's the deal. Maybe you hear that and you're like, I don't know if I can embrace that. Like, that's a big faith step to just say, like, I can't understand it. I don't know. But let me tell you, no other worldview has a better and more in-depth explanation. Right now, still, in some form, the beginning of the universe in scientific terms, which they're kind of going back and forth on something, but still the prevailing thought of how the beginning of the universe started was the Big Bang Theory. But here's what the Big Bang Theory states, is that there were particles there, and then somehow these particles came and there was a reaction and it hit, and then what happened? Bang, right? And then all of a sudden these particles and stuff move throughout, form new elements that form stars, that form planets, and then formed life. Well, guess what the assumption is in the Big Bang Theory? Is there was something there before all that to run into each other to make something happen. And no matter what worldview you go to, you have to have this assumption that something was there before it all started. And the Bible tells us, Genesis assumes that that was God. And like I said, it doesn't tell us how, why, or what, but it tells us that he is eternal, that he always has been, he always will be, and he is in charge of everything. But let's keep moving. Not only do we get this assumption of Genesis, but we also get the truth of Genesis. He keeps going. It says, in the beginning, God. And then he says, created the heavens and the earth. You see, God wasn't just doing anything in the beginning, but we get his first act that the author and God himself believed we should know. He created. Now I want to break down what this was that he created for a second. It says this phrase that he created the heavens and the earth. Now, this first word, heavens, would actually translate into the Hebrew. It would say you could say the realm that God resides, and the realm that God and the heavenly host reside. Now, in ancient Near Eastern terms, when this was originally written, the major belief was, and Egyptians and even some of those early Israelites in some ways believe that some will argue, but in all the other tribes that lived, they thought that God and angels were like just above the clouds. Like in the clouds, in the air is kind of where they resided. Like we just sang a song, right? And coming on the clouds. But like modern day, we take a telescope and you're like, okay, there's nothing behind the clouds. It's just space and stars. You're like, so what does that mean? Like, was the Bible wrong that they had it if? Well, no. Instead, really what this Hebrew word more refers to is not just God hanging above the clouds and hanging by the moon and just chilling up there. But he's actually in this heavenly realm that is separate, the spiritual realm that we don't see with our own eyes there, but that is where God resides. And in the earth, he created the heavens, this heavenly realm, but then he also created the spiritual realm, but then he created the earth. And the earth refers to the known, the observable world that mankind, which we're going to talk about more in the coming weeks, that lives and does life in. Now, here's the truth that may sound so obvious, but it's so important if we're going to understand where the rest of Genesis and where the rest of the Bible heads. It's this, that God has created the universe and everything in it. God has created the universe and every single thing in it. I'm not a person that loves a lot of sweets, okay? I'm more of like a chips and salsa meat guy. I'll take more of that. I'll take less of like the dessert that comes after. But one of the things I love Oreos. And not just any Oreos, like double stuffed Oreos, right? I mean, like single Oreos are just so like lame after you have double stuff. I'm just sorry. Like if Sam's Club could just have a giant pack of double stuff, I'd be happy. But I say all that to say I have probably about 3 to 4 Oreos every single night. Okay, that's part of my ritual to keep this good-looking body that I have. Scott keeps warning me that I should really start working out. But Oreos are in our pantry, and my kids asked me the other week, Dad, why do you never share your Oreos with us? Like, what kind of question is that? And I told them, because I share my house, the food, and everything else with you. Because no offense, my 5, 4, and 8-month-old, you have nothing to your name, okay? Everything you have is from me and my wife. Mom and Dad give you everything, right? It is all us being generous and pouring out our blessings to you, because apart from us, you got nothing, bro. I'm sorry. I could amend that. Archie got like $8 for his birthday and bought a Spidey toy. So he'll have one little Spider-Man he can take with him. But honestly, Genesis 6 sets the same stage for us. That we are like toddlers in this world. And sometimes we get possessive of them, but God's like, hey, everything you have here, yeah, I created it all. And guess what? I own it all. And we are like toddlers in this world where God created our whole universe and everything in it belongs to him. It's all his. Sorry to break this to you, you don't own anything, right? You think you own some, or maybe you're like, oh, does that mean if I have a lot of debt, I don't own that either? Well, that's a different story. We don't have time for that. But this is so foundational, and it's really a hard thing for us to embrace, because so often we kind of skate by this, but we have this idea that what is ours that we can hold on to, that we worked for and we want to be prideful about. I know personally this is something I struggle with a lot because sometimes I'll reflect and I'll, in my pride, think like, man, look at the life I've created for myself. Look how hard I've worked to build this for my family. Look what I've done to do this. And I'll get all high and mighty. And in the back of my mind, God's like, dude, what did you actually do? The only thing in your life is because of his blessings and because of his grace that he has poured out upon me. Let's keep moving and take a look at the genre of Genesis. We see the assumption that God has no origin story, the truth that God has created the universe and everything in it. It's by his grace that we experience it. But then we also get a little bit of hint of the type of book this is. Check out verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1. It says, "Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit was hovering over the surface of the waters." Now, we're going to break this verse down actually a little bit more next week, and we're going to kind of read it in the context that goes a little bit farther than this. But this is a very difficult verse to kind of break down and talk about. There are a wide amount of interpretations. There's a lot of ambiguity in verse 2. Of exactly what is being described here and how it then pertains to the timeline of the creation account that we'll be studying over the next few weeks. But a few observations here. First, we are told in verse 1 that God created the heavens and the earth. But here it immediately goes to the earth. And as we go through the creation account, we're going to hear less and less of the heavens, and we're going to hear more and more about the earth and about the observable there. And actually, we don't hear any more in how he formed the heavens and what they look like, and he doesn't give us kind of more descriptions about that, which brings up a lot of questions. For one, it brings up the question, well, then when did God create the angels? When did God create the heavenly hosts? When did Satan and the demons come? And when did they rebel against God? And we only know about those things because it talks about those later in the Bible, but it doesn't even talk about it here and mentions any of that in these first two chapters and in Genesis. Augustine said it this way, that the Spirit of God who spoke through them did not choose to teach about the heavens to men, as it was of no use for salvation. Here's what we need to establish as we start to go through the book of Genesis, is that it doesn't necessarily answer all the questions we want answered, and in the detail, into the depth that we might think we need. And sometimes we're looking for answers in Genesis, and we're like, I want you to tell me exactly how old this rock is. I want you to tell me this. I want you to tell me that. I wish I was there and could see all the creation, so every answer I have, or every question I have could be answered. And God's like me, like, I'm not going to quite give you all that information. For example, many believe in this verse before we get into creation that this is where the heavenly rebellion of Satan being cast out has occurred. But there's a lot of great reasons to interpret it that way, but we don't know for sure because there's some ambiguity in here. And some of the ambiguity was there chaos, because it says it's formless, and there's this idea of chaos in here, but was it just because God created it and then he needed to form it in order, or is it because there was rebellion and sin already inside the universe? Like, we don't get a clear answer. So here's my question that comes from that. And you're like, what does all this mean? Is like, what kind of genre? What is the way that Genesis is written that it needs to tell us? Because we talk about that a lot when we go through different books in the Bible. Like, we'll read a letter in the New Testament, which is a letter directly to a church. We got that in Romans, we just studied. And it just in like, boom, this is to one people in Romans, and it says, do, follow this. We read the Gospels, and it chronicles the life of Jesus, and it's a narrative and tells us. And then we get to Genesis, and you're like, it's kind of all over the place. Henry Blocher, he wrote a commentary on Genesis, and he describes it this way, that the creation account in the book of Genesis is an artistic literary representation of creation intended to fortify God's covenant with creation. It represents truth about origins and anthropomorphic language so that the covenant community may have a proper worldview and be wise unto salvation. It represents the world as coming into being through God's proclamation so that the world depends on his will, his purpose, and his presence. Let me say that in even a simpler way. That here is the genre of Genesis, is that God has told us what we need to know. You see, Genesis is not meant to be a scientific book, even though it addresses and talks about a lot of scientific things, which we'll mention as we go through this. Genesis is not meant to be a historical textbook completely, even though it speaks of history and it gives us historical, factual information. Genesis is not meant to be a poetic story, even though it weaves in poetic styles and poetic language and poetic literature throughout. Genesis is primarily a theological book that tells us about how great our God is. And you see, when we dive into this book, we're going to see that Genesis is concerned with telling us what we need to know about God and what we need to know about our world. Which leads to this last part that we're going to look at today is the purpose of Genesis. Flip over to chapter 2. And in chapter 2, I'm just going to read verse 4. And we're a few weeks from actually getting to this verse. But I just want to kind of tease this a little bit because there's some ways this looks in the bigger theme of it. And it says this in verse 4 of chapter 2. It says, "These are the records of the heavens and the earth concerning their creation, at the time that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens." Now as I said, we're going to study the rest of chapter 1 in the coming weeks, and we're going to see the creation account of what they describe as the heavens of the earth that he just mentions here in verse 4. But a little cool transition we get here is in that Genesis 1, verse 1, it says God. Now, I'm not one that usually goes to the Hebrew or the Greek in the original language a lot, but I am doing that a little bit today because it's important. And this word that says God here in the Hebrew is translated as Elohim. And what's important here is Elohim was this heavenly, great, eternal, big, gigantic God. Kind of this unrelatable God, right? The God of creation, like we said, that has no origin story, that we can't fully understand, and just like speaking and things are coming into existence. And like when mankind reads this, it just like falls in awe and fall on their face. But in chapter 2, verse 4, it says, the Lord God. It says right at the time that the Lord God. In the verse actually, or the translation here isn't the same. He doesn't say Elohim here. Instead, it's translated to Yahweh. And Yahweh was the name that the Jews used throughout the New Testament to refer to the personal God of their people. You see, what happens from chapter 1 to chapter 2 is the author transitions the unreachable God of the universe to this personal, reachable God that wants a relationship with us. And the majority of this book in Genesis is how God not just created the world, but he created mankind and pursues a relationship with them. In January of 2020, my wife and I moved into our current house now. And this was our second home we had purchased. And we're moving, and we actually are like literally 2 minutes from the church, just kind of across the street pretty much. And as we moved into that house, we were excited because we were like, we need more bedrooms because we're going to have more children, and we have had another child since then. And it's all in God's providence because we bought in January 2020. And if you live in Phoenix, you know what happened to the housing market literally right after that. I thought I got ripped off when I bought the house, and then I waited 3 months and well, this was a great deal, right? Now I can't afford my own house if I had to buy it. So it's great. But as we got in there and we're going around and we're looking at the house, we were excited about where we were going to move into. But it wasn't the structure in the rooms that we were excited about. Having more rooms was exciting. But we were actually moving to a house that was a little bit newer and moving into an older house that had been kind of renovated. But really what we were most excited about is the potential to make it a home and the potential to grow our family. And you see, as we go through the book of Genesis, that we're going to see that God created, he had a purpose for why he created this world. And it is right here, this is the purpose of Genesis, is that God had provided a way for humanity to connect with him. You see, God created the whole earth. He created the world with a purpose for us. That we're going to study this in the coming weeks, that we are the pinnacle of creation, that God didn't just create and tell us all this information in Genesis so that we be smarter in our head, but that we could develop a relationship with him. And here's the thing, that this is displayed throughout Genesis, because after he creates the earth and the animals and mankind, it tells us that God then walks with them in the garden. He wasn't this separated big God that we could never get close to, but he was this God that came down to be with mankind. There is love. There is friendship. And mankind is a reflection of God's amazing image and even is gifted in the uniqueness of God, like ruling over the earth in a loving and just manner. But you see, God created us not just to leave and abandon us, but to connect with us. So what do we do with all this? Because maybe you hear that and you're like, okay, I get it, right? We've walked through this. The assumption of Genesis is that God has no origin story. The truth is that God has created the universe and everything in it. The genre is that God is going to tell us what we need to know, even if we think we need more information. He's going to tell us the foundation. And the purpose is that God has provided a way for us to connect with him. But how does knowing all this, how does studying this further impact how we live our lives? Well, let me leave you with a key thought today, and it is this, that the book of Genesis introduces us to the God of the universe who is also Lord of our life, right? We see this contrast. In Genesis 1, we see this God we can't understand, this God we can't begin to even fathom and think about, that created the whole world. But in chapter 2, we see the God that comes down and starts walking with his people. Today, or I should say tonight at 5 o'clock, is game 7 of the Western Conference semifinals. Why are you guys laughing? You're like, why do you ruin a good theological moment then immediately go to talk about the Suns? I can't help it. It ties in, I promise. But in the playoffs, right, the NBA playoffs are going on right now. And Josh actually wore a Suns shirt, and I didn't wear a Suns shirt. Like, I don't even know what's happening there. Like, he just found out about the Suns last week. No, I'm just kidding. And you guys know I'm native. I bleed in purple and orange and red and white. But anyway, the playoffs are happening. And what's fun to watch during the playoffs and to follow Twitter and with Facebook and social media, whatever, is all the bandwagon fans start coming out. And say, I love my team so much. They're the greatest team ever. Like, I'm cheering for these people. And I'm like, name 2 players. Just do it, please. Go for it, right? That's the mean part of me. But it's one thing, like, when the playoffs start to, start rooting for a team. And you, try to get interested. You try to get invested. But it can be really difficult. But when you've watched that team since the beginning of the year, or if you've been watching this team since the beginning of Devin Booker's career, you even have more respect for it. But when you watch that game and you know that team, you know all the players, you know what the coach should call, the plays they should call, or sub in, this isn't working, and you're yelling at your TV. But there is a deeper level investment because you know it inside and out. You know how this started, and you know ultimately where it's finishing with the championship. But you see, the book of Genesis is going to be very similar. That so often we want to fast forward to the end of the Bible. We want to go to the Gospels and we want to read about the life of Jesus. And Jesus, he lived, he died, he raised again, and we should celebrate that. And that should be the starting point. Because if you start in Genesis and you don't start with Jesus, you're going to be lost, right? That is ultimately the hope in what things are going for. But too often as Christians, and if you are part of the church, we just live there forever and we're like, that Old Testament stuff isn't that important. But it's when we go to the beginning of the book and we see the history laid, we see the foundation laid, we see the secrets and the things starting at the beginning, that when we go and we read about Jesus, we appreciate all that God has done through mankind and throughout history. And here's this journey that we're gonna walk on, that I ask that you come with us, is keep showing up. I know it's summer, I know it's gonna be hot out when we're going through the book of Genesis, but keep showing up, keep reading about the foundation of what God laid in this book, continues to lay in our lives, that we're gonna read about the God of the universe, who also wants a personal relationship with you, wants to save you, and wants to change your life forever. Let's pray this morning.